Hey everybody, we have a pleasure of speaking with Mark Dierolf of Dierolf Plumbing and Water Treatment. This guy has been in wells for decades. He knows more than I can imagine, and it's an absolute privilege to have him. So thank you so much, Mark, for joining us.
Appreciate you having me, Eric.
Hey, my pleasure. So I want to get started because I heard this story once a long time ago, and it's a little bit fuzzy. Can you tell me how you got into the water and the well business?
Yeah, it's sort of ironic. I had worked with a large company in uh, Boston for a number of years, and we did a lot of pump seals and packing, and I worked in the technical division, and it was a lot of travel, so I got out of that. I started working at a local appliance store that happened to do water, and I ended up getting involved in the water business. It's a long roundabout way to get there. But I fell in love with water. I saw it 20 years ago that it was definitely going to be the wave of the future, and that water was going to be the quote gold of the 21st century, and I believe it's shown to be that.
Wow, I've never heard it described as gold. So what does that make it, the clear gold of the 20th century?
Yeah, it just means people are going to fight over it and spend a lot of money to have good water.
I have a memory of us being out at a property for a well inspection, and you said something that caught me off guard. I think what you said was eventually public water won't be available as, I guess, being drinking water. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, I had said that a number of years ago, and I'm surprised it hasn't come to fruition. I think we're working our way there, but I had said a number of years ago that I thought it was just a matter of time before public water would be the ultimate responsibility of the end user. And the reason I say that is because all of public water is produced to a drinking water standard, yet less than 1% of it is actually used for drinking water. The bulk of it's used for waste, industrial production. You're using it for washing, laundry, using the bathroom, all of those types of things. So they're producing a standard for drinking for everything that you use. And I think it's just a matter of time before it becomes uneconomical to do that. The cost to produce that is going to be ultimately on the responsibility of the end user to put in a filtration system to get from a good product to a great product. And we're seeing some of that in our industry now. If you go onto the Pennsylvania, there's a website in Pennsylvania you can see where all the boil water alerts are. There isn't a day goes by where a public water utility isn't issuing a boil water alert because they've had some type of problem with their system.
Yeah. There was an article about a major restaurant in a couple decades back, and they said the cleanest water in the restaurant actually came out of the toilet. And the reason was that they were basically arguing the restaurant wasn't doing a good job of cleaning all the surfaces. So the only thing they were cleaning consistently was the bathroom. So they're like, don't drink out of the ice maker, don't drink from this, don't take from that. But the toilet was clean.
Yeah, there you go. Looks good anyway.
Yeah.
That's right.
What are you going to do? So
Yeah,
let's talk about, quality of water. I have people arguing all the time, well water versus public water. And I know bottled water is a huge topic. Where do you fall in this spectrum? Public, bottled?
Yeah, we do treatment on all of the on public water and well water. Some public water is just well water that's distributed to the public. Other public waters are drawn from surfaces like rivers, streams, that type of thing. So there's a variation, but we treat all types of water. Bottled water is actually a different story, and it's regulated differently than the other types than our well water and our public water. It has different regulations, so that's a totally different industry all on its own. But for our purposes, for homeowners who either they're going to pay for their water, public water, or they're going to have their own private well. There's a lot of variances in the type of water and the quality of water. Most public water is going to deal with issues that are more common. That's why you'll see so many people trying to sell water softeners to people with public water, because it's easy and there's not a lot of strings attached. The problem is most of your bigger issues with public water that you won't necessarily see in a private well, or if you're hearing nowadays in the news that there's potential for medications to be in the water stream, well, that's mostly going to be surface water that has that problem. So it's mostly public water systems that derive their water from a surface water source because it's treated in treatment plants and then put back out into the atmosphere. Into the environment, and then that water sometimes is tainted with medication because we don't have the proper filtration in our treatment system to deal with that, our public treatment system. Private wells are a little bit different. Private wells can have a multitude of issues, but at least you own it and you solve it. And most of the time that problem is solved and it doesn't change.
Okay. So does that mean if should I be testing my public water for medicine coming in, like to see if there's Tylenol in there or something?
Yeah, it's tough to do. There's not a lot of good tests right now that are economical to do for those types of things. It gets really expensive. A lot of times, what people are doing is they're putting point-of-use drinking water systems in, carbon systems, reverse osmosis systems, and that just solves the problem. So sometimes it costs more to test for a problem than it does just to solve the problem that you have. So sometimes those questions come into play with water testing. But we've probably done well, not probably, we have done more water testing on public water sources for real estate deals in the last 2 years than I did in my first 20 combined. So it just wasn't a big deal. And nowadays, with after the Flint, Michigan issue up nationally, it changed the whole landscape of public water and how people view it.
Does that mean it's just an issue that's coming into the public's vision or awareness, or has this been just a newer phenomenon? Because I can't imagine
Probably,
lead in the water is a new phenomenon, but maybe medicine in the water is.
yeah, and it's probably been more related to requirements, standards, and testing have just gotten better and better. I don't think the problems are necessarily new problems. I think it's just we're finding more and more. There's so many more procedures you can test, so much more equipment you can use. We're finding things we didn't know. I think the biggest challenge for my industry is still yet to be figured out, because I think we're going to figure something out in the future that we don't know now, and it's going to cause another challenge. Because right now there's some things we can't. There's 1,600 parameters that you can test for in water, but only a small percentage of them are actually regulated. So most of the other ones you're not testing for unless you really want to spend a fortune testing the water. So, and that's going to change as they find, like, arsenic wasn't a big deal a decade ago, and now it is. There's two reasons for that. Number one, they lowered the limit on arsenic. It used to be 50 parts per billion, and now it's 10. And number two, our equipment's gotten better to test for, so we can find it more frequently.
Can you weigh in on some of the other health concerns? I have people that occasionally talk to me about things like Teflon, plastics, the non-biodegradable materials that are going into our water supply. Do you think that's going to be a bigger issue, or is it an issue?
Yeah, and that's, again, that goes back primarily to public water supplies. Not that it couldn't get in a private well, but again, because most of that stuff is being discharged through waste treatment plants and back out into the environment, most of that is going to be surface water. Now, it's obviously that some surface water can get into private wells, especially during times of flooding, but usually that'll dissipate out over time. But in public water, that's the biggest challenge. Is in public water, most of those things you're reading about are public water issues, not that are surface derived, streams, rivers, dams, that type of thing, where people are drawing from the surface. You'll see reservoirs and those types of things. It's all surface water. So those are more of the waterways that are contaminated with those types of things. Again, not that you couldn't have it in a private well, but it's more. So, but again, things can happen. I did a job, and I can't mention details, but I can tell you it was many years ago in Collegeville, where I did a job, and we found perchloroethylene in the water. And perchloroethylene, one of the things it's used in is in dry cleaning processes. And here they found out that a neighbor owned a dry cleaning company, and he was dumping his solutions in the woods at his house, which was near this person's home. So you can get contamination a lot of different ways. So that was well water. But those things aren't natural, and when you find it, there's a source. And to be honest with you, the DEP and the U.S. Geological Society are pretty good at figuring those things out. So.
Yeah, I was going to say, I've heard my fair share of, there was a diesel leak over here, and
MTBE, from gasoline additives or gasoline stations, that gets into private wells as well as public water. So those are a little more common, but the meds and the Teflons and stuff like that are more from industrial production, and they go through a treatment plant. Most of that is more involved in public water that's derived from surfaces.
Well, I really, I guess, love jumping into like these heady conversations, but let's be real. A lot of our clients are just facing like basic stuff. Like I hear people all the time say, "Ooh, I don't like water softeners because I feel like I can never get the soap off, or it makes my water taste salty." What are you doing? How are we correcting that? Or is that just a byproduct of water softeners? Your water will always be terrible.
No, it won't be terrible. It will be different. There's no question about it. It's rare, but occasionally I'll have somebody tell me that their water that's softened tastes flat. That's because what you're doing with a water softener is you're removing the calcium and magnesium from the water. It's changing that for sodium, not salt. Salt is sodium chloride.
Okay.
You're exchanging it for sodium. If it's done in our marketplace, unless you have extremely hard water, like 50, 60, 70 grain hard water, which is rare in our marketplace, there's really not enough sodium in there to be a real challenge. The problem is if the softener isn't built right, isn't installed properly, or isn't rinsed properly, then you can get that issue with the sodium where it tastes salty. But if everything's done properly, there's very little transfer where you're going to see a significant difference in your drinking water from the sodium that's exchanged. The reason it tastes flat is because most bottled water companies will provide water that's enhanced with minerals, and those minerals are usually what we're removing, calcium and magnesium. Not because you're getting any kind of health effects from that in the little bit of water that you drink, but because that's what gives water taste. So it's sort of a formula for taste. So some people will notice that. A lot of times if you take that same water and run it through a carbon bed, like a Brita filter or something like that, it fixes the problem because it takes the flatness away.
Okay.
So there's a number of different ways you can help with a customer in that situation.
Yeah, if they're having problems, they should bring you out because it might be a problem with the current setup, or it might just mean you need a secondary system.
Correct. Yep, that's right.
Great. I appreciate that very much. Here's another one that I get all the time. People say, ooh, I want to be on a well because well water is free and public water is not.
Yeah.
Can you weigh on this issue?
Yeah, we'll replace your first pump and then we'll see how free it is. For the most part, wells last a long time if they're drilled properly and they're cased properly. They'll provide water for a long, long time, but it still isn't free. You still have the electricity to run the pump. You're still going to have a well pump that, while they don't go bad frequently, they still do go bad, every decade or so. And then, of course, you have your well tank that you have to deal with. Most people have that unless they have something called a constant pressure pump, which is a totally different system, a little more expensive. But in any event, it's not free. You're just amortizing. Instead of paying for that monthly, you're paying for that all at one shot when you fix a problem, for the most part.
Are they comparable in terms of, like you're saying, every decade I might be replacing a pump or something? Does that mean that if I amortize it over a decade, are they basically the same expense, or is one more or less expensive?
I don't think there's a significant difference over time. It depends on the municipality. Some municipalities charge more for water than another. I think we're going to get to that point of equilibrium, though, where it becomes a challenge. Again, because of what I said earlier, delivering that perfect water for everything. But
yeah.
But drinking.
So let's touch a little bit more about the well pump you were referencing, because low water pressure is also a big issue people complain about. I'll be doing a showing and somebody will say, hold on a second, they'll turn on the faucet and then they'll turn on the shower and they say, oh, I just wanted to make sure. What should we be checking for? Is there something we should look at while we're out looking at houses?
Well, it's awful hard to tell if you have a pressure problem what it's related to. Sometimes it's something very simple. They got a filter they haven't changed in a while and it's clogged. Sometimes it's because you've got a larger home and it's piped with all half-inch piping, and if it is and you're trying to run 2 or 3 things at one time, you're going to outstrip the volume that it can produce. So it's not necessarily a pressure issue. Sometimes it's a volume issue. So those are the types of things that are very difficult to tell first glance. You've got to look into it more. Sometimes it is if you have a well and you have poor pressure. I'll see it primarily with jet pumps that are in the basement of the house. They don't produce the well pressure. The water pressure from a jet pump isn't as good as a submersible pump if the submersible pump is sized right. So, and again, some of that with the well is about how the well recovers. I had a well the other week that produced 10 gallons a minute for 30 minutes and then ran out of water, but 15 minutes later refilled. It means if you run that water at the recommended 4 gallons a minute, it would have lasted a very long time because the well actually recovered at 4 gallons a minute. So there's a lot of variances in pressure, and how you look at that and what's causing that, it's very difficult to do first glance. Sometimes it's a fixture problem. You have great pressure at the bathtub, but you have no pressure at your kitchen sink. It could either be the fixture or clogged aerator. Sometimes it's something as simple as cleaning your screen.
Okay. I want to take a quick step back and highlight that little fact you said about like 10 gallons per minute.
Yeah.
4 gallons per minute. What's
Yep.
4 gallons is the minimum. So that's what people are kind of expecting. If the system's operating properly and I turn on the faucets, is that a fair statement? So
Yeah, FHA standards, the federal government is 3 gallons a minute.
Okay.
But one of the strictest standards is Chester County. There's only 3 counties in Pennsylvania that are regulated. Chester is one of them, because private wells really don't have any rules or regulations for the most part. But Chester County does, and their standard is 4 gallons a minute. It's 480 gallons for 2 hours, which if you do the math, that's an average of 4 gallons a minute for 2 hours. So it's a good standard, I think, and I use that in a lot of my testing when I do a well, because it's a good standard to live by. It's what I would want as well on buying a home, and I think it's very difficult for a family to live on less than. So when I talked about recovery rates, when you have a well and it's, for example, let's just say you have a deep well, it's drilled 600 feet deep and it has a large pump. Mm-hmm. It's probably not an accident that they drilled that well 600 feet deep. They probably did that because they needed the column of water to provide that 480 gallons for 2 hours, because the well might only recover at 2 gallons a minute, but because our column has 600 gallons sitting in it of water, you're going to be okay. You're going to use water, then it's going to rest and refill at a rate faster than you can empty it. However, if you were to continue to run water on that well, that 600-foot well, at 6 gallons or 4 gallons a minute, and it only produced 2, eventually you would run that well out of water and it would slowly refill again. So as long as everything else in the well is working properly and your recovery is right, it would refill again.
Yeah. And I got to be honest, it was one of the most fascinating things that I had been through from an inspection standpoint when I watched you out there testing a well. Because it's really mind-blowing. I mean, the well itself is only like that big, right? It's, people think, oh, I'm going to fall in and Lassie's going to come save me or something. No,
right.
You don't fit inside. Your head might not even fit inside.
Right. Maybe a cat, right? But
yeah, a cat. Wow, that's morbid. But you're right when you said like 600 feet, because if you think about it as like that kind of column, and I don't know how many feet, what is it, 1 foot per gallon or?
About 1.33 gallons per foot, anywhere from 1.33 gallons to a gallon and just under 1.5 gallons per foot of column, depending on the diameter of that well.
Right. So, and that's why it would last so long, because you literally have hundreds of gallons of water stacked up in a vertical column. And it won't
Correct.
be necessarily accessible for the first 100 feet of the 600 you're referencing, but that still gives you 500 feet of water, which is, if
correct.
I'm doing math right, what,
700 gallons of water.
Yeah.
Something like that. Yeah.
Which is incredible.
So,
and then, like you said, with the refill as well, this is where my mind was blown, because you drew water out of the system, and I think you drew it out for like, I don't know, 30 minutes or 60 minutes, and you looked at how high the water was in the well and then how quickly it recovered. The crazy thing for the well we were testing was it didn't drop at all, which meant that the water was coming in from laterally, I guess, into the well as fast as we were able to draw it out. Is that correct?
Yeah, and actually, when I looked up the stats on that well, we found out that while we were drawing water at 6 gallons a minute, it was recovering at about 12 gallons a minute. So it would have been very hard to draw the water out fast enough.
Yeah, that makes
under normal use.
A couple pumps in there and see if I could actually draw it out faster.
Right.
Fill up your pool and the neighbor's pool all day long and be okay.
Right. Yeah, and that's a lot of that is based on how the well is drilled, and there's risers. There's a lot of details that well drillers would know better than I would on some of that stuff. But yeah, generally you look for the recovery rate of the well, how much you draw the water. It gives you a good insight into that well.
Okay.
Very important information.
So this is something that's huge. We should absolutely be doing well inspections every time we buy a well, because we need to know about the quality of the water and the mechanicals, if I understand correctly.
At the very least, if the well's newer or there's a lot of good information on it, but you'd almost always want your own water quality test. There are, I want to carefully say this, there are good labs and not so good labs out there. And, all the labs that we work with are fully certified labs. So they do a real good job. They'll do a lot of work with the DEP and EPA. So those labs are well-rounded and can provide us good answers on every parameter we test for. Other labs might only be certified in one or two parameters, and the rest of them, while they're testing those parameters, they're really not fully certified to do those tests.
Gotcha.
So there's a lot of variations in labs too, and how that works. But yeah, the test is probably the biggest thing for people. That's what their biggest concern is. What am I actually consuming? But on a secondary standpoint, it's you do want to make sure that if you have a private well, it produces enough water for your family.
So what should we be testing? Now, I know there's a range, everything from like the bare minimum FHA stuff to, like you said, the 15,000 or 1,500 items theoretically possible.
Yeah, I've only ever had one customer in my whole life who's done that. So,
what did it cost?
That was about $3,400.
Wow.
Yeah. So, but for the most part, people are testing regulated things in water, and you can, you're going to spend somewhere in the neighborhood of $300 to $400 to get a really comprehensive water test, which is more typical. Basic test, you can get water tested for as little as $50. If you're just trying to do a real basic coliform test or something like that. So it's going to vary on what your preferences are as a buyer. But you just remember, ultimately, that's the water you're consuming, and it has to be important to you. I'm amazed at how many people are worried about some things that don't seem to matter much to your health, but they could care less about the water they drink. And that's a personal preference with each individual. But you have to let them make those decisions. All you can do is give them the information.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. I mean, there are some food products that I see people consume, and I think, you're basically killing yourself slowly, one bite at a time. And
Right.
Water is, I guess, so omnipresent that nobody thinks about it. I mean, the water looks clear, so it's safe to drink. No, it's not. Have you ever gone camping and looked at some water and said, "Oh, I'll drink that," and then got sick? There you go.
Yeah.
Can we go back to the coliform you were talking about? Because I don't think very many people know what that is and what we do and why it's important to look at that.
Yeah, coliform bacteria, it's total coliform. It's the most common test you'll do in water. Even the smallest treatment systems that are regulated, that have a PWS ID or a Pennsylvania Water System ID number, like schools and daycares and restaurants and stuff like that, even those places at a minimum have to do a coliform bacteria test. Most of them monthly. Some of them more frequently than that, but the very bulk of them are monthly. And then annually, at least, they have to do a nitrate test. So at a very minimum, the Department of Environmental Protection requires those people to do that test. So it's an important test. If you're a private well owner, you should probably do that test once a year, because things can change. And it's ironic. I just sat in on a presentation by a company who did a major study on actually Bike Run did a major study on wells in a particular marketplace. Actually, one of our marketplaces, I believe it was in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, was one of the test areas they did in the country. And they found that if they drew 100 samples, 100 different samples over a period of time throughout the course of several days for coliform bacteria, they found that about 40% of those tests would fail. So when you do a test for coliform bacteria, unfortunately, you're just getting a snippet in time that says, oh, it passed, or oh, it failed. And tomorrow, the next day, you might get lucky and that number could be different. And that's what they found through that study.
So that's kind of scary, because if I understand correctly, you're saying of that 600-foot column, I wish I had a prop, the 600-foot column, that's your well, you could have a bacteria infection anywhere at the top, the middle, or the bottom. And if that goes into your water, now you're consuming lots of bacteria that's not good for your health. And that might not show up every time you turn on the tap or turn on the faucet and get water out. Is that right?
Well, in general, that's right. Most of the time, though, if you have something that's contaminated with bacteria, you're going to see that all the time. But on occasions, they have found, which to me, it's an amazing study, because I hadn't really saw those numbers before. I was pretty taken aback by it. In general, though, if you have a coliform problem and it's a legit problem, it's going to be a fairly constant thing. 80-90% of the time, you're going to have that. And a lot of that has to do with the testing standards as much as it does anything else. When a lab gets a sample of most things, they're like we test for volatile organic compounds in water. That sample that they get is pretty is pretty conclusive, because it's going to be spread throughout the well. Coliform is just a little bit different in how it tests, because you're testing for growth in a 100 milliliter sample, and maybe you happen to get 100 milliliters. It's not a lot of water. 100 milliliters is very little water, and maybe we just didn't have one in that jar, but the next jar had 4 of them. So that's the real challenge with coliform bacteria is the way it's tested and how we count it. With chemicals, it's a little bit different when they test for nitrates and chemicals and those types of things.
Okay. Yeah, and don't get me wrong. I mean, it's like if you ever seen like algae or something like that growing in a pool, or in a cup because you went to science class or something like that for your kids. I mean, you have a pretty good idea. If I took a scoop of that, I'd find some kind of algae in there, like little particles or something. But is it possible I could scoop some out? And you're saying 100 milliliters and it not have any?
Yeah, and I don't want to use a real gross example, but I had an individual who tried this one time, and he took cleaned his toilet and did a sample.
Yeah.
And just dipped them out of the bowl, and he got 3 of the 4 failed, but 1 of them passed.
Wow.
So, yeah. So, in that particular array. So, that's just a little snippet, but, again, it's because of what you're counting. You're just collecting that 100 milliliters, again, very little bit of water at the end of the day. And you're just counting colonies in that particular sample.
So can we talk about shocking a well real quick? Because that's the solution everyone says. Oh, I've got coliform. I'm just going to throw some, bleach in there, call it a day.
Yep. So we don't do it anymore because there's a liability problem with shocking wells. And the reason I say that is because you can shock a well. For example, if you had a flood and your well had surface water get into it, you can shock a well and get rid of the problem, and most likely it'll be gone. Unfortunately, there's no way to know that until you test again in 3 months and 4 months. So you can shock a column of water, and if you shock it heavy enough and it gets into the aquifer, you can kill all the bacteria in a significant portion of that. But if it's in the aquifer, if it's in that area, it's going to eventually come back. And they found that to be the case in greater than 50% of the time if it's not something that's been put in the well. Like somebody didn't drop something in the well or a flood water or something. If it didn't enter that way and you shock a well, it's coming back, most likely.
Yeah, because it's still down there in the environment. You can't.
Correct. So it's not, and the other biggest problem with it is once you shock a well, most people overshock a well because they don't know the calculations to do it right. And when they do that, now you've got to run the water for a long period of time to clear it. And it's been rare, but over a handful of times in my life, I've watched people run a well dry doing that. And then it sort of ruins a settlement because now they're out of water and their column recovers slowly, and now they have dirty water, or they have a lot of iron in the well and they shocked it and turned the whole thing brown, and it takes sometimes days to clear, so it scares people. So it's not, in my opinion, it's not the best solution unless there's a very specific reason you're doing it.
Yeah, and it's scary because when the water starts coming out brown or orange, like you're saying, you're just like, uh-oh.
It freaks people out. It does go away eventually, but it does freak people out.
Yeah, that's too funny.
And sometimes you'll have water like that and it passes bacteria. It passed, but it still don't look too good.
Right. So. And that's what you're drinking and that's what you're showering. No, you might want to go live somewhere else, I guess, for a few days. So I appreciate so much you taking the time to chat with me, and hopefully we have a chance to catch up again. I know we will at some inspections, but maybe to pick your brain with some follow-up questions that people have.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. It's really been a pleasure being on here with you, and I thank you a whole lot for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mark. I'll talk to you soon.
Take care, Eric.
Bye-bye.